The dust of the Barty Ranch was a language of its own, speaking of drought and desolation. It coated every surface, a fine, ochre powder that clung to the throat and settled in the soul's deepest creases. For Eleanor Vance, it was the taste of failure. From the veranda of the main house, a structure too grand for the despair it contained, she watched the sun bleed across the horizon, setting fire to the distant mesas. She was a cattle queen without a kingdom, a title inherited from her father that felt more like a lead-line crown. Her legacy was this sprawling, thirsty land and the beasts that roamed it, none more defiant than the one in the high-walled corral. Batsi et Upsilon. The name was a prayer and a curse. A magnificent black stallion, bred for strength and spirit, he had become a vessel of pure, untamable rage. 30 men, seasoned ranchers with hands like petrified wood, had tried to break him. 30 men had been broken instead, left with splintered bones, shattered confidence, and a story to tell of the devil horse at the Barty. The latest attempt had ended an hour ago, with a medic stitching up a gash in a man's shoulder and Eleanor writing out a payment that felt like another piece of her father's dream crumbling to dust. Her foreman, Silas, stood beside her, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "I told you, Eleanor. He's poison. Fit for nothing but a bullet." The words were pragmatic, sensible, and they made her feel physically ill. To kill something so fiercely alive felt like a surrender to the dust, an admission that everything beautiful and wild must eventually be ground down to nothing. It was then she saw him, a silhouette against the dying light, walking towards the ranch house. He was a drifter, that much was clear from the worn bedroll on his back, and the way he moved as if the ground beneath him was temporary. He wasn't large, not like the brutish men who had boasted of their ability to conquer her horse, but there was a stillness in his carriage, an economy of motion that spoke of a different kind of strength. He stopped at the bottom of the veranda steps, his gaze lifting to meet hers. His eyes, in the twilight, were the color of a shadowed canyon, holding depths she couldn't fathom. He asked for nothing more than a day's work for a meal and a place to sleep in the barn. It was a common enough request, but as he stood there, patient and silent, an idea, desperate, reckless, and utterly mad, took root in Eleanor's mind. "I have work," she heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and formal in the vast quiet. "But not in the fields." She gestured with her chin towards the high corral, where the phantom sound of a furious snort still seemed to hang in the air. "There is a horse. If you can put a saddle on him, you can have a place here for as long as you want it." Silas scoffed beside her, a sharp, derisive sound. "Ma'am, this ain't some ranch hand. This is a vagrant." The man's gaze never left Eleanor's. He showed no offense, no reaction at all to the foreman's insult. He simply waited. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jude," he said. The name was as sparse and solid as he was. "You see that horse," Eleanor continued, testing him, testing herself, "and you understand the offer." Jude's eyes flickered to the corral, and for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Not fear, but a profound and sorrowful understanding. "I understand," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be swallowed by the immense landscape. And in that moment, Eleanor felt a shift, a tiny tremor in the foundation of her despair. It was the foolish hope of a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood, but it was hope nonetheless. The next morning, the sun rose with a brutal, white-hot intensity. The air was thick with skepticism. The remaining ranch hands gathered along the fence of the round corral, their postures leaning toward morbid curiosity. They had seen this performance 30 times before, and they expected it to end the same way, with the crack of bone and the spill of blood. Silas stood nearest the gate, his arms crossed, a smug certainty etched onto his face. He had given Jude a leather whip, which the drifter had politely refused, leaving it coiled on a fence post like a sleeping snake. Eleanor watched from the veranda, her hands clenched so tightly around the railing that her knuckles were white. She felt a fool. She had staked her dwindling authority on the quiet promise of a man she knew nothing about, a man who now stood before the gate with nothing but the clothes on his back and an unnerving calm. Jude did not stride into the corral. He opened the gate, slipped inside with a quiet click of the latch, and stood just inside the fence, utterly still. War Cry was at the far end, a sculpture of coiled muscle and furious energy. His head was high, his nostrils flared, tasting the scent of this new man. His eyes, black and intelligent, were fixed on the intruder. The stallion let out a piercing scream, the sound that had given him his name, a challenge that had sent hardened men scrambling for the fence. Jude did not flinch. He did not raise a hand or a voice. He simply stood, breathing. He was a stone in a raging river, an anchor in a storm of animal fury. War Cry pawed the earth, sending clumps of dry dirt flying. He snorted, a plume of hot air misting in the cool morning. He took a few trotting steps, circling, testing the perimeter of this strange, quiet threat. The other men had yelled. They had postured. They had cracked whips to show dominance. Jude did nothing. He merely watched, his head tilted slightly, his gaze soft but unwavering. Then, as the stallion began to move in a wide circle around him, Jude began to move too. It was not a pursuit. It was a mirror. When War Cry sidled to the left, Jude took a slow, deliberate step to his own left. When the horse tossed its head, Jude subtly dipped his own chin, an echo of the movement. He was not cornering the animal. He was joining its dance. The ranch hands muttered amongst themselves, confused. This was not breaking. This was nothing. It was a waste of time. What in God's name is he doing? Silas spat, his voice a low growl of disgust. But Eleanor couldn't look away. She was mesmerized. She saw it not as nothing, but as everything. Jude was speaking to the horse in a language older than words, a language of space, of pressure, of respect. He was saying, I am here. I see you. I am not a threat. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, beating down on the man and the horse. Jude never faltered. He remained a point of stillness in War Cry's world, a constant, patient presence. The stallion's frantic circles began to slow. The furious snorts softened into deep, shuddering breaths. The wild terror in his eyes was slowly being replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. He stopped his pacing and stood, head lowered, watching Jude from across the dusty expanse. In that long, silent standoff, Eleanor felt the tension on the ranch shift. The air of morbid expectation began to dissolve, replaced by a thread of something fragile and uncertain. This was not the violent spectacle they had come to see. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. Finally, as the afternoon shadows began to stretch, Jude took a single, slow step forward. War Cry held his ground. He didn't bolt. He didn't charge. He simply watched, his ears swiveling to catch every nuance of the man's quiet presence. Jude took another step. The space between them, once a battlefield, was becoming a bridge. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her fingers finally uncurling from the railing. She didn't know what this was, but it was not failure. It was the beginning of something she had no name for. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the slow, deliberate patience of the man in the corral. Jude's method was one of quiet consistency. Every morning, he would enter the round pen and simply exist within War Cry's space. He brought fresh water, tipping it into the trough with a steady hand. He scattered rich, sweet-smelling hay, never pushing it on the horse, but leaving it as an offering. He never carried a rope, never a whip, never a tool of coercion. His only instrument was himself. The ranch hands' initial confusion curdled into open mockery. They called him the horse whisperer, the words dripping with sarcasm as they passed him on their way to more practical, violent work. Still praying to that beast, Jude? One would call out. Maybe you should try singing to him next. Another would jeer. Jude never responded. He absorbed their scorn with the same equanimity with which he absorbed the sun's heat, letting it roll off him without leaving a mark. Eleanor found herself defending him, a reaction that was as surprising to her as it was to her men. He has until the end of the week, she declared one evening to Silas, who had once again suggested putting the horse down. "He is costing you money and making you a laughingstock," Silas countered, his loyalty to her father warring with his disapproval of her methods. "He is costing me less than a broken leg and a lawsuit," Eleanor retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Let him work." Her defense of Jude felt like a defense of herself, of the last desperate flicker of hope she harbored. She spent hours on the veranda, her ledgers and paperwork forgotten on the table beside her, her gaze fixed on the circular drama unfolding below. She watched as Jude began to shrink the circle of his presence. He would walk the perimeter slowly, rhythmically, and with each rotation, he would shave an inch off the distance between himself and the stallion. Cry watched him, his intelligence sharp and discerning. The horse was learning this new human, this creature who did not demand submission, who did not radiate the frantic, predatory energy of the others. One afternoon, a week after Jude's arrival, a milestone was reached. It was not a grand event, not a cinematic breakthrough, but a moment so subtle Eleanor almost missed it. Jude had been standing in the center of the pen for nearly an hour, his back partially to the horse, a gesture of profound trust. Cry, who had been standing by the water trough, took a deliberate step, then another. He walked slowly, cautiously, across the dust until he was only a few feet behind Jude. He stretched out his long neck, and his velvety nose hovered just over the man's shoulder, not touching, but breathing in his scent. He inhaled a deep, shuddering breath, and then exhaled a soft puff of air against Jude's shirt. Jude did not turn. He did not move. He simply acknowledged the moment with a slight softening of his shoulders. A silent conversation had passed between them. "I am here. I know." Eleanor's heart ached with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. It was as if she were witnessing the mending of something she hadn't known was broken within herself. Later that evening, as Jude left the corral, his face filmed with dust and sweat, he passed by the veranda. He paused, his gaze lifting to meet hers. He didn't smile, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first time he had directly acknowledged her vigil. Eleanor found her voice. "He seems calmer." Jude's eyes flickered toward the corral, where the black stallion now stood peacefully, no longer pacing the fence line like a caged demon. "He was never angry," Jude said, his voice low and raspy from a day of disuse. "He was afraid." The simple statement landed in Eleanor's chest with the weight of a revelation. She had seen only rage, a violent, masculine force to be conquered. Jude had seen fear, a wound to be healed. As he walked away toward the barn, she remained on the veranda, the setting sun casting long shadows that looked like bridges connecting the house, the corral, and the quiet man who was slowly teaching her the difference between breaking something and making it whole. The quiet progress in the round pen did not go unnoticed, and it acted like a grid of sand in the well-oiled machinery of the ranch's hierarchy. Jude's silent success was an affront to the established order, a challenge to the brutal pragmatism that had governed the bar T for generations. The whispers of the ranch hands, once tinged with mockery, now carried a sharper edge of resentment. He was an outsider, a drifter who had accomplished in weeks what they, with all their bluster and experience, had failed to do. Their respect for Eleanor, already thin, began to fray. They saw her faith in Jude as a woman's folly, a weakness that threatened them all. Silas, the foreman, became the mouthpiece for this growing discontent. He had been her father's right hand, a man who believed strength was measured in calluses and scars, in the breaking of wills, both animal and human. He saw Jude's methods not as gentle, but as a dangerous and effeminate corruption. "He's got you charmed, Eleanor," Silas said one evening, cornering her near the stables. His voice was low, conspiratorial, as if he were trying to save her from herself. "The men are talking. They say you're letting this drifter run the ranch, that you've gone soft. The horse is no longer a danger," Eleanor stated, her voice colder than she felt. Inside, his words stung, echoing her own deepest fears. Had she gone soft? Was this all a foolish, emotional gamble? It's not about the horse anymore, Silas pressed, stepping closer. It's about what's right. What her father would have done. He would have put a bullet in that beast and sent that charlatan on his way. The mention of her father was a deliberate blow. She had lived her entire life in his shadow, trying to measure up to his legend. He had been a hard man, respected and feared in equal measure. He had built this empire by breaking the land, by breaking the cattle, by breaking the men who worked for him. It was the only way he knew. "My father is gone, Silas," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm running this ranch now." The confrontation left a bitter taste in her mouth. Later, seeking a moment of peace, she found herself walking toward the round pen. The moon was high, bathing the landscape in a stark, silver light. Jude was there, not inside the corral, but leaning against the fence, simply watching War Cry, who stood dozing in the center. She approached quietly, her boots sinking into the soft dust. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "They think you're a fraud," she said, the words coming out without preamble. Jude didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the horse. They might be right. His admission was so unexpected it disarmed her. "But you don't believe you are?" It wasn't a question. "I believe that what's broken can be mended," he said softly. "But you can't mend something by breaking it further. You have to find the original wound." He finally turned his head, and his shadowed eyes met hers. "He's not fighting me, Eleanor. He was never fighting any of them. He's fighting what was done to him before he ever came here. Someone hurt him badly, made him believe a man's touch was nothing but a promise of pain." His words hung in the air between them, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond the stallion. Eleanor thought of her own life, of the hardness she had adopted as armor after her father's death, of the loneliness that felt like a constant, low-grade ache. She, too, was fighting what had been done to her. She was fighting the expectation that she be as hard as her father, fighting the condescension of men like Silas, fighting the fear that she was not enough. In Jude's quiet understanding of the horse, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of being seen herself. The resentment of her men was not just about a horse anymore. It was about change. Jude represented a new way, a quiet, patient strength that threatened the loud, violent power they understood. And as Eleanor stood beside him in the moonlight, she knew that choosing to support him was no longer just about saving a horse. It was about choosing what kind of queen she was going to be. A change was coming. Eleanor could feel it in the air, a building pressure that mirrored the dark, bruised purple clouds gathering on the western horizon. A storm was brewing, one of the violent summer squalls that could turn the dusty plains into a torrent of mud and fury. The tension on the ranch was just as volatile. The men worked with a sullen, resentful silence, their sidelong glances at Jude filled with animosity. The peace he had brought to the round pen had thrown the rest of the bar tea into disarray. The storm broke in the late afternoon. The sky turned a sickly yellow-gray, and the wind began to howl, kicking up curtains of dust that stung the eyes and choked the breath. Eleanor stood on the veranda, watching as the first fat drops of rain splattered against the dry earth, leaving dark, spreading circles like wounds. Her gaze was fixed on the corral. Jude was inside with War Cry. The stallion, unnerved by the plummeting barometric pressure and the shrieking wind, was becoming undone. All the patient progress of the past weeks seemed to evaporate in the face of the storm's fury. The horse was a wild thing again, pacing, snorting, his eyes rolling with white-rimmed panic. The other hands had taken shelter in a barn, but Jude remained. He stood in the center of the pen, his shirt plastered to his back by the rain, his hair whipped across his face. He was the calm eye of two converging storms, the one in the sky and the one inside the horse. War Cry's fear escalated into a frenzy. He reared, his powerful forelegs slashing at the turbulent air, his screams swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. He was no longer just afraid of the storm. He was afraid of the man who stood so placidly within his world of chaos. He saw a trap, a predator waiting for a moment of weakness. He lowered his head and charged. It was the moment Silas and the others had been waiting for, the proof they needed that this gentle method was a sham, that beneath it all the beast was still a beast. Eleanor's heart seized in her chest. A strangled cry escaped her lips. She gripped the railing, her mind screaming for Jude to run, to scramble for the fence, to save himself. Jude did not run. He stood his ground, his boots planted in the rapidly deepening mud. He did not raise his hands in defense or aggression. He simply turned his body slightly, angling himself not as a target, but as a rock in a stream, something to be moved around, not through. His entire posture conveyed a single, powerful message. I will not hurt you, and I will not let you hurt me. The stallion, 1,000 pounds of terrified muscle and bone, thundered across the corral. The ground shook. He was moments from impact, his teeth bared in a defensive snarl. And then, at the last possible second, something shifted in the horse's frenzied mind. He saw not a threat, but the unwavering stillness he had come to know. He veered, his hooves sliding in the mud, sending a great spray of earth and water into the air. He galloped past Jude, circling around him in a wide, shuddering arc before coming to a stop, his flanks heaving, his body trembling. The wind howled, the rain fell in sheets. In the heart of the maelstrom, Jude took a slow, deliberate step towards the terrified animal. He raised a hand, not quickly, but with a fluid grace, his palm open and facing downward in a gesture of peace. He murmured something, his voice too low to be carried on the wind, but the tone was one of reassurance, a low, calming melody. He reached the horse's side. Warcry flinched, but did not bolt. Jude laid his hand gently on the stallion's soaking, trembling neck. It was the first time, the first intentional, unforced touch. A current seemed to pass between them, a transference of calm from the man to the horse. Warcry's head drooped. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him, a release of fear so profound it was almost visible. He leaned his weight, just slightly, into Jude's hand. From the veranda, Eleanor watched through the rain, tears mingling with the water on her face. She was witnessing a miracle of trust forged in the crucible of storm. It was more than just the taming of a horse. It was an act of profound grace, a testament to the fact that even in the midst of the most violent chaos, a quiet, steadfast presence could offer sanctuary. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain and sage. A fragile peace settled over the bar tea, mirroring the quiet transformation within the round pen. The dramatic breakthrough had solidified a new reality. Jude no longer simply shared space with Warcry. He worked with him. The sessions were a continuation of their silent dialogue. A light pressure from Jude's hand on the horse's flank was a request to move, and the horse would yield. A shift in Jude's weight was a cue to change direction. There was no force, only invitation and acceptance. The saddle blanket was introduced next, not thrown onto his back, but first offered for a sniff, then laid gently over the fence, then finally, after days of patient repetition, placed softly onto his withers. Warcry trembled, but stood his ground, his trust in Jude overriding generations of instinct. Eleanor found herself drawn from the lonely perch of the veranda. She started taking her morning coffee near the corral, sitting on an overturned bucket, becoming a quiet part of the landscape. She was no longer just the owner, the queen issuing decrees from on high. She was a witness, a student. She and Jude began to share the silence. Sometimes he would join her after a session, accepting a cup of coffee with a nod of thanks. Their conversations were sparse, circling the practicalities of the ranch, the condition of the fences in the north pasture, the price of feed, the health of a new calf. They never spoke of their pasts, of the wounds that had shaped them, yet in the space between their words, a deeper understanding grew. They spoke of the land as if it were a living thing, of the horses not as livestock, but as individuals. One evening, she invited him to take supper in the main house. The grand dining room, which usually echoed with loneliness, felt different with his presence. The flickering lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a weariness around his eyes that she had not seen before. They ate in near silence, the clink of silverware on china the only sound. It was not an awkward silence, but a comfortable one, the kind shared by people who have no need for pretense. "You're good with him," Eleanor said, breaking the quiet. With war cry, Jude finished chewing a piece of bread before he answered. "He's an honest creature," he said. "He doesn't know how to lie about how he feels." Most men could learn from that. The observation was simple, yet it cut straight to the heart of the matter, to the deceit and posturing of men like Silas. The growing rapport between Eleanor and Jude did not go unnoticed. It was a visible shift in the ranch's power dynamic, and it bred a venomous resentment. Silas and his loyalists saw Jude not just as a rival for the horse's trust, but for Eleanor's. Their mockery turned to outright hostility. One afternoon, as Jude was walking from the barn, Silas and two other hands blocked his path. "Think you're the king around here now, drifter?" Silas sneered, his body language aggressive. Jude stopped, his expression unreadable. He did not rise to the bait. "I'm just doing the work I was hired for. The work you were hired for is done." Another man chimed in, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jude's feet. "The horse is calm. Time for you to move on. That's for Eleanor to decide," Jude said, his voice even. Silas stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "She ain't in her right mind. She's a woman making emotional decisions. It's up to us to protect this ranch from her mistakes. And you," he poked a finger into Jude's chest, "are her biggest mistake." Jude looked down at the offending finger, then back up at Silas's face. A cold, quiet anger flickered in the depths of his eyes, a fire banked low but burning hot. He didn't say a word. He simply held Silas's gaze until the foreman, unnerved by the lack of fear, faltered and stepped back. Jude walked past them without another glance. But Eleanor, who had witnessed the exchange from a distance, knew this was far from over. The quiet work in the corral was finished. The real battle for the soul of the Bar T was about to begin. The animosity that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over on a day of suffocating heat. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the tempers of the men were frayed to the point of breaking. Eleanor had ridden out early to check on a water pump in the far pastures, leaving the main ranch under a tense and watchful quiet. It was the opportunity Silas had been waiting for. Fueled by a morning of whiskey and a festering sense of emasculation, he decided it was time to put the drifter and the horse in their proper places. He saw Jude's work not as healing, but as a trick, a veneer of calm that would shatter under real pressure. He would be the one to expose the fraud. Accompanied by his two most loyal cronies, Silas strode to the round pen. War Cry stood inside, dozing in the shade of the high fence, a picture of tranquility. Jude was in the barn, mending a piece of tack. "All right, boys," Silas slurred, unlatching the gate with a loud clang. "Let's show this fancy horse what a real cowboy can do." They entered the pen with ropes and a heavy saddle, their movements aggressive and loud. The sudden intrusion, the familiar scent of leather mixed with the acrid smell of whiskey and malice, struck War Cry like a physical blow. His head snapped up, his ears flattened against his skull. The peace he had learned was instantly shattered, replaced by a tidal wave of remembered trauma. He saw not three men, but the ghosts of every man who had ever tried to hurt him. He backed away, snorting, his body trembling. "Get the rope on him," Silas yelled, advancing. One of the men, clumsy in his bravado, managed to fling a lariat over the stallion's head. The moment the rope tightened on his neck, War Cry exploded. It was not a charge of aggression, but a detonation of pure terror. He reared, screaming, fighting the choking restraint with the desperation of a creature fighting for its life. He thrashed, his powerful hooves striking out blindly. The man holding the rope was thrown off his feet, the hemp pulled violently through his hands, stripping the skin from his palms. The horse spun, his panic absolute, and slammed his shoulder against the second man, sending him crashing into the fence with a sickening crack of wood and, perhaps, bone. The chaos was absolute. The sound of the stallion's frantic screams and the men's terrified shouts reached the barn. Jude dropped the leather he was mending and ran. He burst into the sunlight to see a scene from a nightmare. Silas stood frozen, the saddle dropped in the dust, his face pale with shock and fear. One man was on the ground, clutching his bleeding hands, and another was slumped against the splintered fence. And in the center of it all was War Cry, his eyes wild with terror, the rope still hanging from his neck, his sides lathered in sweat and foam. A cold, lethal fury settled over Jude. It was an anger so profound it was silent. He walked towards the gate, his movements deliberate and dangerous. "Get out," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the chaos with the sharpness of a razor. Silas, shaken from his stupor, turned on him. "This is what happens. See? He's a killer. You didn't fix him." "I said," Jude repeated, his eyes locking on Silas, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Get out." Now, he took a step into the corral, and for the first time since he had arrived at the bar T, the men saw the man beneath the quiet drifter. They saw a man who was not afraid of violence, but who held it in such careful reserve that its rare appearance was terrifying. Silas and the conscious hand scrambled out of the pen, dragging their injured companion with them. Just as they cleared the gate, Eleanor came riding in at a gallop, drawn by the commotion. She took in the scene in a single, horrified glance: the injured men, the dropped saddle, and the terrified horse. Her eyes met Jude's across the dusty corral, and in them she saw not only a righteous anger, but a deep, sorrowful pain for the trust that had been so brutally broken. The world shrank to the confines of the round pen. Outside, there was chaos and accusation. Inside, there was only the wreckage of trust. War Cry was a prisoner of his own terror, circling the pen in a frantic, stumbling gait, the rope around his neck a symbol of his betrayal. He was lost in the memory of pain, unreachable. Jude stood just inside the gate, his silent fury having given way to a profound, aching sorrow. He had to undo this. He had to lead the horse back from the precipice. He began to move, not towards the horse, but in a slow, rhythmic circle in the opposite direction, mirroring the dance they had first shared, trying to re-establish the language they had built together. He murmured, his voice a low, continuous stream of sound, not words, but tones of reassurance. "It's all right. I'm here. You're safe now." From outside the fence, Eleanor watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was her fault. Her absence, her inability to control her own men, had led to this desecration. Silas stood nearby, nursing his wounded pride, ready to pronounce his final judgment. "You see?" he called out, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and vindication. "He's untamable, a killer. You have to put him down now, Eleanor. It's the only way." His words were a spark to the dry tinder of her resolve. For weeks, she had been a spectator, a queen watching from her castle. She had allowed Jude to face the danger, to absorb the scorn, to do the work of healing while she remained safe. No more. In a moment of absolute clarity, she knew what she had to do. She strode to the gate and unlatched it. "Eleanor, no." Jude's voice was sharp, a command born of fear for her safety. She ignored him and stepped inside, closing the gate behind her. The dust, the heat, the overwhelming smell of the horse's fear, it was all-consuming. War Cry saw her, another human in his space of torment, and shied violently, crashing against the far fence. "He trusts you," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She looked at Jude, her gaze unwavering. "Let him see that he can trust me, too." It was an abdication of her authority and an acceptance of her responsibility. She was no longer issuing an order. She was making a plea to be a partner. Jude saw the change in her, the steel that had replaced her uncertainty. He gave a single, sharp nod. He was the anchor, but she would be the harbor. She did not approach the horse. Instead, she walked to Jude's side, standing with him, presenting a united, calm front. She mirrored his stance, his stillness, his quiet breathing. They stood together, 2 points of unwavering peace in the horse's swirling storm of panic. It took a long time. The sun beat down. The injured man's groans from outside the fence faded as he was helped away. There was only the sound of the horse's ragged breathing and Jude's low, constant murmur. Slowly, painstakingly, the stallion's frantic circles began to widen. His gait smoothed. The wild, rolling terror in his eyes began to recede, replaced once more by a glimmer of recognition. He saw Jude, the man who had brought him water and peace. And he saw the woman, a constant, quiet presence at the man's side. He slowed to a walk, then to a stop, his head hanging, his body trembling with exhaustion. Jude approached him slowly, and this time, Eleanor walked with him a step behind. Jude reached the horse and gently, so gently, began to work the rope loose from his neck. As it fell to the dust, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through all three of them. Warcry stood, spent but calm, accepting Jude's hand on his neck. Then Eleanor, her own hand trembling, reached out and laid it on the horse's powerful shoulder. The stallion flinched for a split second, then relaxed under her touch. At the fence, Silas watched, his face a mask of disbelief and defeat. The miracle had happened again, but this time, his queen was at the center of it. Eleanor turned, her hand still resting on the warm, solid presence of the horse she had helped save. She looked at her foreman, her voice clear and carrying across the corral, devoid of anger, but filled with an unshakable authority. "Silas," she said, "collect your pay from the office. You are no longer welcome at the bar tea." A new quiet descended upon the ranch in the days that followed Silas's departure. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a stillness born of peace and purpose. The men who had followed Silas, those who thrived on conflict and cruelty, drifted away, leaving behind a smaller crew who were willing, if hesitant, to learn a different way. The bar tea was no longer just a place for breaking cattle. It was becoming a sanctuary. The round pen, once a stage for violence, was now a classroom for patience. The story of Warcry, and the quiet drifter who had tamed him without a whip, had begun to travel on the wind, carried by passing traders and ranch hands. Soon, a neighbor arrived, leading a filly with fear-bitten eyes who shied from every shadow. "Heard you have a man here," the neighbor said to Eleanor, his hat in his hands. "Who has a way with troubled horses?" Eleanor looked at Jude, who was watching from the barn doorway. It was a silent question, an offering. Jude simply nodded, accepting the new charge without a word. The bar tea was changing, and so was Eleanor. The lead-line crown of her inheritance now felt lighter. The queenly facade she had worn as armor was flaking away, revealing the resilient, compassionate woman beneath. She worked alongside her men, her hands learning the texture of worn leather and coarse rope, her face gaining the fine lines of sun and wind. She spent her evenings not with ledgers, but with Jude, sometimes talking, often just sharing the comfortable silence on the veranda as dusk painted the sky in shades of rose and violet. They began to share pieces of themselves, not in long confessions, but in brief, scattered sentences that slowly filled in the empty spaces. She learned he came from a place where horses were commodities, their spirits shattered for the sake of speed and efficiency. He had walked away from it all, unable to participate in the breaking, seeking a place where he could mend instead. He was not a drifter by happenstance, but by conviction. In turn, she spoke of her father, not the legend, but the man, a man driven by a fear of failure, who had believed hardness was the only shield against a harsh world, and who had unintentionally passed that shield and that fear onto her. Jude listened, his canyon-deep eyes filled with an understanding that needed no words. He saw the woman who had inherited a kingdom of fear and was now, single-handedly, transforming it into a realm of trust. The work with Warcry was nearly complete. Jude finally introduced the saddle, a light, simple thing. He did not cinch it tight as a mark of ownership, but laid it on the horse's back as an agreement between partners. The stallion accepted it, standing solid and calm, his trust absolute. Jude would lead him around the pen, the empty saddle a quiet promise of what was to come. He was teaching the horse to carry a weight, not a burden. One afternoon, Eleanor stood with him by the fence, watching as Warcry followed Jude with a relaxed, easy gait. "You saved him," she said, the words full of a gratitude that was as much for herself as for the horse. Jude shook his head, his gaze fixed on the magnificent animal. He was never lost, he replied. He was just waiting for someone to speak his language. He turned to her, a rare, small smile touching the corners of his mouth. You speak it too, Eleanor. You just had to remember how, in that moment, Eleanor understood the profound truth of her journey. She had not hired a drifter to solve a problem. She had opened her gate to a man who had, in turn, opened a gate within her, leading her back to a strength rooted not in hardness, but in empathy. The Bar T was becoming a sanctuary, not just for broken horses, but for its lonely queen. The morning of the ride dawned clear and bright, the sky a vast, crystalline blue. A sense of quiet anticipation hung over the ranch. This was not a test or a conquest, but a culmination, the final verse of a long and patient poem. Jude entered the corral, where War Cry greeted him with a soft nicker, a sound of recognition and welcome. There was no hesitation, no fear. Jude moved with the same unhurried grace he had shown on the very first day. He brushed the stallion's gleaming black coat, his hands moving in long, soothing strokes. He saddled him, the cinch tightened just enough to be secure, an act of mutual consent. He bridled him, the bit resting gently in the horse's mouth. Then, with a smooth, fluid motion, Jude swung himself into the saddle. For a moment, they stood perfectly still in the center of the pen, man and horse as one. There was no bucking, no resistance. War Cry shifted his weight, adjusting to the presence of his partner, and waited for a cue. Jude nudged him forward with the slightest pressure, and the stallion moved, not with the frantic energy of his past, but with a powerful, confident stride. They circled the pen once, then again, a perfect picture of harmony. Eleanor watched from the gate, her heart full. This was the sight she had once believed impossible, a testament to the quiet power of trust. Jude rode towards her, the horse's movements as liquid as water, and stopped just before the gate. He dismounted, his feet landing softly in the dust. He looked at Eleanor, his expression serious and gentle, and then he did something she never expected. He took the reins and held them out to her. "He's your horse, Eleanor," Jude said, his voice quiet but resonant. "He was always yours. The gesture was everything." It was not an act of handing over a conquered beast. It was a transfer of trust, a recognition of her own part in this journey, an affirmation of her own strength. Her hand trembled as she took the leather strips. They felt warm and alive. She looked from Jude's steady gaze to the stallion's dark, intelligent eye. The fear that had lived inside her for so long was gone, replaced by a profound sense of connection. She stepped forward and raised her hand to War Cry's face, stroking the soft space between his eyes. He leaned in her touch, his breath a warm puff against her palm. She had faced down the resentment of her men, defied the ghost of her father's legacy, and stepped into the storm. She had earned this peace. She stood there between the quiet man and the mended horse, the reins held loosely in her hand, and looked out over the Bar T. The dust was still there, but it no longer spoke of desolation. It was simply the earth, waiting for rain. The ranch was no longer a battlefield, but a haven. It was a place where a lonely cattle queen, a wild stallion, and a drifter who knew the language of fear had taught each other that the deepest wounds could be healed not by breaking, but by the slow, patient, and revolutionary act of building trust. The future of the ranch, like the vast expanse of land before her, was unwritten, but for the first time in her life, Eleanor Vance looked upon it not with dread, but with a heart full of resilient, quiet hope.